So, a classic posse tracking someone through the woods with their trusty hound dog, policeman in the front, other people carrying guns, and the dog is thinking, I can't smell a damn thing. So that was the senses. Now we're going to move into the upper levels of the central nervous system, into the brain. I'm afraid I'll never figure out how to make my invention work. You are too logical. Use the right side of your brain. I must call on my creative side. Now it doesn't work and I want to cry. The right brain, left brain stuff is, I mean, it's not completely wrong, but it's much, much, much too absolute to be reliable. So, going to do the same thing. I'm going to walk you through, and you can write stuff down as we go. That way I'm closer to the microphone. Here's your spinal cord. Here's the medulla oblongata, the stretched medulla, and the pons, which is part of this structure. Here's your cerebellum. Doesn't appear to be labeled on this. And this is your cerebrum with some subparts labeled, and your pituitary gland hanging underneath. There's actually a little support structure of bone there. Somebody decided it looked like a saddle on a Turkish or on a Turkish horse. They call it the Turkish saddle. I don't know if they've renamed that or not. So these are the bits and pieces. Remember, your spinal cord is your primary relay. It's connecting you to your body. Now, there are other nerves that run down from your brain to your body, what they call cranial nerves. And some of them are very important. They run, make sure that your automatic stuff runs on the right schedule, so your lungs and your heart and your digestive system. And that's why sometimes if people have a spinal cord injury up high and they actually break their spinal cord, they lose their connection to their body to run your muscles and such, but they don't stop breathing if the cranial nerves that also run along that same track, if those have not been broken. If you break the cranial nerves, then your heart stops beating and you stop breathing, and that's bad. And that's why people do die immediately, sometimes of broken necks. If you've broken the cranial nerves, that's a problem. This part of your brain is involved in running that stuff. Is it adjusting your heartbeat, adjusting your breathing rate, to some extent adjusting the movement of food through the digestive system. When I was a kid and violence on television was very much a no-no. One convenient way to kill somebody off that who wasn't a bad guy, but you needed them out of the way, like the hero had fallen in love, but he couldn't be in love in next week's episode. They'd have the love interest, trip and fall on the back of their head, and suddenly they'd be dead. Theoretically, that can happen. For people that open the skull of the pig, that part of the skull is pretty thick. Not that easy for an impact to get into the brain. But this is the part of the brain, if you were to say, impact it and knock it unconscious, then you would stop breathing and your heart would stop beating. But it doesn't happen particularly very often. Up above, the cerebellum. When your brain makes a decision and says, okay, we need to be saying this, or I need to dance to the side, or I need to put my hands up, or stuff you're not even aware of, like while I'm talking, my hands are moving. Your cerebellum is the part of the brain that goes, okay, this muscle needs to move and this muscle needs to move. Okay, boss, we'll coordinate it, we'll get it done. And that is your coordination center. There is some evidence also that you may retain some memories of particularly physical activities in your cerebellum. Like if you had brain trauma, you probably would still be able to ride a bicycle if you're able to ride a bicycle before. There are people that have brain trauma where they cannot store new memories. 50 First Dates was a movie about that, where every day she woke up and it was like, the same day over and over and over again, because she stopped being able to remember any new day experiences. She just remembered where she was when the trauma happened. It does happen. But people with those types of brain injuries can often be taught to do something physical, like knit. So you teach them how to knit, and then the next day, you give them the yarn and the knitting needles, and they look at it and go, what is this? I don't know how to knit. And you just start them on it. You go, oh, I'll teach you. But it turns out their cerebellum apparently is retaining the physical dexterity, what we call muscle memory, to be able to actually do it. They don't actually remember having learned to knit, but their cerebellum, we would say, oh, their hands remember, but it's actually your cerebellum that remembers to learn how to knit. Your brain is split in half, right side and left side. This is kind of a slice down the middle. And there are connectors in between. There's wiring that goes back and forth and integrates what happens on one side to what happens on the other side. In extreme situations of epilepsy, where what happens in epilepsy is parts of your brain just fire. All the nerves just kind of go off. And it can cause you to blank out and become unconscious. It can cause, widespread muscle messages to just kind of give you a seizure. And in extreme cases, to keep it from spreading from one hemisphere, one side of the brain to the other, they will go in there and just cut the connections off. And then your two hemispheres are kind of working somewhat independently of one another, including your two visual sides that we talked about when we talked about vision. In some really young kids with very, very serious epilepsy, they've actually gone in and taken one whole hemisphere out. Now, as an adult, your hemispheres have become a little bit too specialized to do that. But as a kid, you take the hemisphere out, and some kids recover, and you wouldn't even know they were missing half of their brain. The half that's left just picks up and does everything that it was supposed to. Doesn't happen for everybody. It's all a matter of timing, and everything's individual. But the connector is called the corpus callosum. See, right there, corpus callosum. I mentioned the meninges before, the membranes that go around the brain. Here's your skull, here's the little bit of fluid-filled space. Here we're going to talk about in a minute. Here's your pituitary connected to your hypothalamus. We've mentioned that before, and connected up there to your thalamus. Here's your cerebellum. This is considered the brain stem, the pons and the medulla that run the automatic stuff. This is just a cutaway view. So your hypothalamus, in some not terribly sophisticated books, sometimes called the reptile brain, is that when you look at primitive vertebrates, the brain gets more and more involved, and the upper parts get bigger and bigger and bigger. So when you look at, say, a snake brain, you don't see a lot of this. You see what this is recognizably, but the rest of it's not so clear. And so they go, oh, they don't really have the higher functions. If you've ever had lizards, they each have personalities. Is that not so much true for snakes or turtles to some extent. But they've got stuff going on other than just their primitive lizard brains, which is what people tend to call the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is your monitoring center. We talked about that. It sends messages to your pituitary to run a bunch of stuff in your body hormonally. Also, it keeps track of things like carbon dioxide levels and temperature and other kinds of things. But it also is the seat of what are called primitive urges. Hunger, thirst, sex, fear. Those are the types of things that are supposed to be at least routed somewhat through your hypothalamus. Here's a question. Of all the recreational drugs that people take, one of them has its primary impact on receptors in the hypothalamus. Which one is it? Gee, has an effect on your hunger. That's the biggest clue. Because weirdly enough, it has the effects on the other parts, but it doesn't always affect them the same way. It does tend to make people hungry, so it tends to push that in a particular direction. But in the fear, some people, it makes them paranoid and fearful, and some people it makes them mellow and not fearful at all. Sex drives, some people it ramps it up, some people it ramps it down. I think most of you know I'm talking about marijuana here. The thalamus is not a great comparison to compare your brain to a computer, but what else are we going to compare it to? And you can compare your thalamus to your central processing unit. It directs traffic. Information comes in from your body, and your brain goes, so what the heck's happening here? Memory, have we seen one of these before? Have we heard this voice before? Have we seen a situation like this before? And so it goes into your memory. And while it's doing that, it's going, okay, well, we're gonna need to remember this later, so let's package this and put it over here, and we'll put it away permanently when we're sleeping. But it's a major, major, major traffic director, your thalamus. Pulls in things like emotional responses from the front of your brain, your limbic system. Oh, I've got my sheet over here. I do want to talk, and you've got a handout about this. Our memory works on 2 levels. Well, it actually works on 3 levels. Is that we've got kind of our immediate memory and our sensory levels. And then we've got our temporary memory. This is what we take the stuff that happens to us over the course of a day or a couple of days, and we kind of shove it into a room going, we'll come back to you later. And then when you're sleeping, you go into that memory center and you go, okay, let's put these away where we can find them long term. You're what they call a permanent memory. And your permanent memory is divided into bits and pieces where emotional aspects go here and sensory aspects go there, and cognitive aspects go in other places, and then you kind of gather them back later. But we do that mostly during what they call REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. Now, I have a theory of REM sleep. You're not looking around in your dreams. And your dreams, in fact, are kind of a remnant of, okay, well, we got to put this part of the memory over in this closet. What's in the memory files tends to come out in bits and pieces in a not terribly organized fashion. And if your brain is cognizant enough to try to make imagery out of it, which is what happens when you're dreaming, it's still having a lot of trouble making any sense of it. But there's a reason why your dreams tend to be connected to things that have happened to you over the last few days. It's because those memories are being stored in those files, so those files are going to be related to the stuff that's been happening to you. Now, my theory is, I read years ago, I have not been able to find this again, so this may be total crap, but I read a book, and one of the things that suggested is that when you talk to somebody and you ask them to remember something, when you're trying to remember certain types of memories, you kind of stop looking at things in your vicinity and your eyes tend to drift. And if you're trying to access emotional memories, it drifts one way, and if you're trying to get sensory memories, it drifts another way. And so depending on the type of memory that's being evoked, your eyes may drift in a different direction while you're not really looking at anything. As I said, haven't been able to find that source since. It was many, many years ago, and I haven't been able to find a source that talks about this. So it may be total crap. But I've watched people, when you talk to them and ask them questions, and it does seem to hold up as an idea. And I do think that it does, and that you're going through your memories very quickly. You're storing a couple of days worth of memories in a fairly short period of time. And I think depending on what files you're open, your eyes are just drifting in those directions very rapidly, rapid eye movement. You're not looking around at a highly sped up dream, but could be. That's a good place to, is it a good place to stop? Let me see what else I got here. Nah, I'm going to do the rest of this. Of course, we have conditions associated with the brain. Epilepsy, stroke, where you cut off blood flow to part of the brain. Your brain is very unhappy when you cut off its oxygen supply. And it will complain mightily if your arteries get clogged and shut and the blood supply is interrupted. Brain damage is a big deal. Both chemical brain damage from toxins like ethyl alcohol, doesn't necessarily kill brain cells, but definitely damages brains. And of course, there are birth defects that affect this. We talked about cerebral palsy, which is really cerebellar palsy, because in an infant, in us, if we cut the oxygen supply off to our brain, this is the first thing that's going to complain, because it's using a lot of oxygen. This barely functions in an infant's brain. This is much more ready to be to complain and to produce damage from low oxygen conditions. So cerebellar palsy. Tell your friends and neighbors. In Alzheimer's, there's a protein made inside your brain cells that, for reasons nobody quite understands, starts to be exported and accumulate between the cells. And it starts to disconnect them from each other. So if your brain is a big network of connections, some of this accumulation will block roads. And your brain is going crazy trying to find ways around the blockages, which is why people with Alzheimer's have good days and bad days when it starts to get really progressive, where there are days where the brain seems to be able to find a way around the damage for a while, but it doesn't tend to be able to hold on to that. So they'll remember who you are one day, and another day they won't even, they'll either confuse you with somebody or they won't even know you at all. Very, very frustrating for, I think I mentioned this before when I talked about aging, but people with those types of problems with their brain don't necessarily know that the problems are there. They're frustrated in that they're being told stuff about the world that doesn't make sense to them, but they don't necessarily know that they are not making the connections that they're not making. At least that's the Alzheimer's people, what they say. There's a lot of genetics associated with how your brain works. The genetics of personality, the people that do research in personality genetics are always apologizing because their basic findings tend to be that your personality, your basic personality is built in from your genetics. It's there when you're conceived. And there's not a lot of steering that parents can do. And people go, well, what about identical twins? Is that they don't have the same personalities. It turns out if you sit them down and you run them through a battery of personality tests, that inside they have the same personalities. But what they often do, at least this is the assumption growing up, is because they're always with each other, they play out different aspects of the personality to the world, where they're like one whole personality, but different, this one deals with that parts of it, and this one deals with those parts of it. At least that's what the personality geneticists come up with. Neurotransmitters, the chemicals that connect parts of your brain, really, really big deal. That's what they're going after with a lot of drugs, psychoactive drugs, where you're affecting neurotransmitter connections. Cocaine releases a lot of neurotransmitters in the pleasure centers of the brain to the point where it can actually deplete them. Normally, you release these chemicals, you break them down, you reabsorb them into the original cells. There's a big recycling thing going on. But if you overproduce a lot repeatedly, so that you can't quite get them recycled in time, the bits and pieces kind of drift off in the tissue fluid, then you can compromise that part of your brain's ability to function normally. People who are habitual, long-time users of cocaine do lose a lot of their pleasure sensations when they are not high. It can come back, but that's a very powerful addiction drive when you're not really feeling pleasure without the bump of the drug. Schizophrenia, you've got a handout that talks about this. What it looks like is happening in schizophrenia is, like right now, we've got voices in our heads, right? There's all these little things telling you, oh, this person doesn't mean that, or what did I do yesterday, or all these other sorts of voices. And we are aware that they're all us. Apparently in schizophrenia, that awareness erodes. And the voices people hear the voices in their heads, but they become convinced that they're not them, that they're, in some cases, did you hear that? They hallucinate external explanations for it, because we like to explain things, right? We're people. And when it doesn't always make, there's obviously nobody around, maybe it's the dog, maybe it's God talking to me, is that they come up with what to them is the closest to a rational explanation they can come up with. And, if it's God talking to you, you better listen to what the voices say. But you can actually redirect energy in somebody's brain and make them unsure of whether those voices are themselves or not. That's one of the strong indicators that that's what's going on in schizophrenia. In other things like bipolar, where your production of neurotransmitters and connections go up and down and up and down, that can be kind of moderated with certain types of chemicals, is that psychiatric drugs, anybody who has any connection with that knows they're very trendy, is that drug company will come out with some big new thing, and that's what they'll be prescribing for a while until the next big new thing comes along. And it can be very tricky to go into a psychiatrist and go, it is, it's working fine, I don't want to try something new. And they go, oh, this will be better, this will be better. Or you go, the side effects are just, I don't want to be on it because of the side effects. They go, oh no, it works fine. Maybe we need to up the dosage. I've actually talked to people where that was the response to, this isn't doing what it needs to do, and the side effects are horrendous. Oh, we need to up the dosage on you. Give you worse side effects than you had before. You have an interesting handout on multiple personality, which is a debatable whether those things actually exist as separate personalities or just personality kind of avatars. That's probably what's going on, where you kind of defensively split off these avatar personalities, but they're not fully formed three-dimensional personalities. I read an article a few years ago that was trying to connect depression to altitude, that there's more depression and suicide, say, in the Rocky Mountain part of the country than in the lower, closer to sea level parts. Haven't seen any follow-up to that, except I have heard people talk about the suicide rates and the depression rates, and that does seem to be sustained, that it, in what we would consider more rural mountainous states, there seems to be a bigger problem. Is that, so maybe lower oxygen levels may long-term have effects on people's brains. Okay, so that's it for the systems part of the course. Now we've got one more section where I'm going to talk to you about how medical research is done.